Camp 18, Featherstone Park, Northumberland, October 1944. The hospital wing doors opened onto a room so clean it seemed to shimmer. White tiles reflected overhead lights that cast no shadows. Equipment hummed with quiet precision. 3 German nurses stood motionless at the threshold, hands still raw from weeks scrubbing wounds with boiled rags and prayer. They had worked in collapsing field stations where morphine was measured in drops saved from the dying. They had operated by candlelight while walls crumbled from shelling. Now they stared at something impossible, a facility that looked like it belonged in peacetime, not in the 6th year of war. The transport truck had rumbled through English countryside for 2 days. Margaret Bauer pressed her face against the canvas flap, watching hedgerows roll past under skies so grey they made the land look ancient. Beside her, Nurse Ilse Werner sat rigid, her medical handbook clutched like a talisman. The 3rd nurse, young Frieda Schumann, had stopped asking questions somewhere past Birmingham. They were part of a rare exchange, German medical staff captured in Normandy after D-Day, now being processed through British POW facilities. The Geneva Convention mandated proper treatment for medical personnel. What that actually meant, none of them knew. The guards who met them at Newcastle spoke no German, but their movements were efficient as they helped the women down from the truck. Rain misted through air that smelled of coal smoke and wet grass. Margaret's legs trembled from 2 days of sitting. Ilse stumbled on the step, and a British corporal steadied her elbow. "Careful now, miss," he said in a tone that suggested habit rather than hostility. The drive to Camp 18 took 90 minutes through rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly. Through gaps in the canvas, Margaret glimpsed stone cottages with smoke curling from chimneys, sheep scattered across green fields, villages that looked untouched by war. In Germany, cities burned. Here, life continued as if the world weren't ending. The propaganda had promised British civilians starving, their island fortress crumbling under blockade. But the landscape rolling past looked fed, whole, almost peaceful. Featherstone Park materialised through the rain like something from before. Rows of Nissen huts curved across farmland, each one identical. Watchtowers punctuated the perimeter fence. But the guards visible in them seemed more interested in staying dry than in watching. The administrative building sat squat and functional, flying a Union Jack that hung limp in the wet air. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Ashworth met them in his office. He was older than Margaret expected, perhaps 55, with grey threading his temples and spectacles that caught the lamplight. He gestured to chairs. The nurses sat, backs straight, hands folded. "You'll be working in the camp hospital," Ashworth said through an interpreter. "We have approximately 6,000 prisoners here, Germans primarily. Your job is to provide medical care under supervision of our British medical staff." Margaret found her voice. "What kind of hospital?" Ashworth smiled slightly. "You'll see in the morning. For now, get settled. Hut 12. Supper at 1800. He paused, studying their faces. "I know what you've been told about us. What you believe. I can't change that with words. Only with what you witness. Give it time." That evening in the mess, Margaret watched British orderlies and German prisoners queue side by side, not at the same tables, but eating the same food. Mutton stew, potatoes, carrots in rich gravy, bread with actual butter. Frieda ate slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks with each spoonful. Back in Germany, her mother was surviving on turnip soup and black bread. Here, prisoners ate better than generals. Later, lying in her bunk, Margaret stared at the corrugated ceiling. The hut was cold but dry. The mattress thin but clean. Through the window, she could hear someone playing an accordion. The tune was German, a folk song from Bavaria. A British guard passed by, pausing to listen before moving on. Nothing made sense anymore. Morning broke grey and drizzling. Margaret woke to the sound of a whistle, sharp and military. She dressed quickly in her old nursing uniform, pressed but patched. Ilse braided her hair with practiced efficiency. Frida's hands shook as she tied her shoes. Major Sarah Fletcher met them at the hospital entrance. She was younger than Margaret, maybe 35, with dark hair pinned under her cap and eyes that assessed them with professional interest. "Good morning," she said in careful German. "Welcome. Follow me." The hospital doors opened. Margaret forgot to breathe. The ward stretched 40 feet, lined with iron beds that stood on proper legs, each covered with white sheets, so clean they glowed even in the grey light. Windows filled the western wall, flooding everything with diffused natural light. But it was the equipment room visible through an open door that made her knees weak. Machines she'd only seen in medical school textbooks. An X-ray apparatus, massive and connected to dedicated electrical lines. Sterilization equipment with pressure gauges. Glass cabinets filled with surgical instruments that gleamed like silver. A pharmacy with locked cupboards keeping medications at controlled temperatures. Oxygen cylinders lined against one wall, painted green, each labelled with pressure ratings. Ilse made a small sound in her throat. This is a prisoner hospital. This is Camp 18's medical facility," Fletcher replied. Her voice was matter-of-fact. "We treat approximately 150 patients per week. Everything from common ailments to emergency surgery. Let me show you the surgical theatre." The operating room could have belonged to Guy's Hospital in London before the war. Overhead lights on adjustable arms, anaesthesia equipment with regulators and flow meters, a surgical table that tilted mechanically. Frida touched the light switch with one finger, tracing the Bakelite surface. "Electricity," she whispered. "Constant electricity." Fletcher flipped the switch. Bulbs blazed to life, casting illumination so even and bright that every corner emerged from shadow. "We have backup generators," she explained. "Surgery can't stop for power failures." In the field stations Margaret had known, surgery meant hurricane lamps and hope. Surgeons operated by feel as much as sight, their hands moving through flickering darkness while orderlies held torches. She had seen men die because a doctor couldn't see a bleeder. She had held lights with aching arms while surgeons amputated limbs, racing against blood loss and the ever-present darkness. Fletcher led them to the pharmacy. Shelves lined with brown bottles and white boxes, all labelled in English. "M&B 693, she said, touching one cabinet. "Sulfonamides, morphine tartrate, whole blood for transfusion. We have supplies for 3 months. More arrive fortnightly." Margaret's throat tightened. M&B 693. In Germany, sulfur drugs were precious, rationed, saved for officers. The wonder medication that stopped infections before they turned septic. German pharmaceutical production had collapsed under bombing. Factories that made antibiotics now made nothing at all. And here, the drugs sat in rows upon rows, more medication than Margaret had handled in her entire career. "How?" Ilse's voice cracked. "How do you have all this?" Fletcher looked at her steadily. "Industrial production, pharmaceutical firms working constantly. The war effort includes medicine, not just munitions. Every POW camp in Britain has supplies like these. It's not exceptional. It's standard." Standard. The word hung in the air like smoke. The tour continued. Fletcher showed them the dental surgery equipped with electric drills and porcelain for reconstructions. The isolation ward for tuberculosis with proper ventilation systems to prevent spread. The laboratory where technicians ran blood counts and urinalysis using microscopes that made German equipment look medieval by comparison. In one corner stood a machine Margaret didn't recognize. Fletcher demonstrated, placing a blood sample inside. Motors whirred. "Hemoglobinometer," she explained, "gives us hemoglobin readings in 3 minutes, what used to take 20 minutes of manual comparison." Frida was crying again, not from sadness now, but from something else. Rage, perhaps, or grief. "We could have saved them," she whispered. "All those boys. If we'd had these things. Just the antibiotics alone." Fletcher's expression softened. "I know. I'm sorry." They spent the morning learning British procedures, sterilization protocols that seemed excessive until Fletcher explained infection rates under 3% compared to the 25% Margaret had considered inevitable. Blood transfusion techniques that use stored blood instead of hoping for immediate donors. Anesthesia administration with precision equipment that let patients sleep pain-free through procedures that German patients endured awake and screaming. At noon, Fletcher took them to the recovery ward. 15 beds held German prisoners in various stages of healing. A man with his arm in a proper plaster cast, another recovering from hernia repair, a third being treated for pneumonia, oxygen flowing through a rubber mask connected to those green cylinders. One prisoner, Klaus Hoffmann, recognized Margaret from the transport. "Nurse Bauer," he called weakly. "You work here now?" "Yes." She moved to his bedside. "What happened?" "Appendix. They cut it out 3 days ago." He pulled back his pajama top slightly, showing a bandage taped to his abdomen. "The surgeon, British surgeon, he gave me something. I felt nothing. When I woke, it was done. They gave me tablets for pain. Real tablets, not just aspirin." His eyes filled. "They treated me like I was one of their own." Fletcher stood at the ward's centre, hands clasped behind her back. "The Geneva Convention requires equal medical treatment for prisoners. But beyond that, we believe sick people deserve care. Nationality doesn't change that. Neither does the uniform they wore." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Back home, the party taught that the British were decadent, weakened by democracy, incapable of sacrifice or discipline. Yet here, they had built medical facilities that surpassed anything Germany possessed, and they used them to save the lives of enemy soldiers with the same care they'd give their own. That afternoon, Fletcher assigned them duties. Ilse would work in the surgical unit assisting with operations, Frida in the pharmacy learning British drug protocols, Margaret in the main ward handling daily care and minor treatments. "You'll work alongside our nurses," Fletcher said. "Learn from each other. We're all medical professionals here. The war doesn't change that." As evening approached, Margaret made her rounds. She checked temperatures, changed dressings, administered medications under supervision. The British nurses worked efficiently, but without coldness. They chatted with patients, made careful jokes, treated each man as a person rather than a number. One nurse, Helen Davies, helped Margaret with English medical terms, writing them phonetically so Margaret could remember. At 1800 hours, Margaret sat in the nurses' station, writing in the journal she'd kept since Normandy. The words came slowly, fighting past years of propaganda and doctrine and fear. "Today I saw what medicine could be if we cared more about healing than destroying. If we built hospitals instead of weapon factories. If we treated human life as sacred, regardless of flags. I don't understand this war anymore. I don't understand what we're fighting for. But I understand this. The people we called enemies care more about saving lives than we ever did." She closed the journal. Through the window, the Northumberland sky showed patches of clearing. Hills stood dark against the sunset. Somewhere in Germany, her family lived under bombs and rationing. Here, prisoners ate 3 meals daily and received medical care that surpassed anything available to German civilians. The propaganda had been lies, all of it. And now she had to live with that knowledge. Weeks became months. Autumn rain gave way to winter frost. The hills turned white. Then the camp. Then the world. Margaret learned British medical procedures with the hunger of someone who'd been starving without knowing it. Major Fletcher proved a patient teacher. She demonstrated suturing techniques that left clean lines instead of raised scars. She explained antibiotic protocols, which drugs for which infections, dosing schedules that maximized effectiveness. She taught triage systems that prioritized patients by need rather than rank, a concept that felt almost revolutionary to Margaret. In Germany, Margaret said one morning during tea, we treat officers first, always, even if an enlisted man is dying and the officer has only minor wounds. Fletcher paused over her cup. Why? Because they're more valuable, strategically. But medically, Margaret had no answer. Fletcher continued carefully. Every life has the same value in a hospital. That's the principle we operate on. I don't care if a patient is a brigadier or a private. I care about who needs help most urgently. Medicine isn't about military hierarchy. It's about saving lives. The concept settled into Margaret's mind slowly, like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. How many enlisted men had she watched die while doctors tended officers with minor complaints? How many lives lost to a system that valued rank over need? Ilse's transformation was more visible. The surgical theatre became her domain. She assisted on appendectomies, hernia repairs, trauma surgeries with a skill that impressed the British surgeons. Dr. Thomas Bradford, the head surgeon, requested her specifically for complex cases. She has excellent hands, he told Fletcher, and she anticipates 3 steps ahead. That's rare. One morning, Bradford let Ilse close an incision herself. He stood at her shoulder, guiding but not controlling. Even stitches. Good tension. You've done this before. Many times, Ilse said, focusing on the needle. But in field stations, by lamplight, while the ground shook from artillery. Bradford was quiet for a moment. We forget sometimes what conditions are like on the other side. Here, we have everything. There you were performing miracles with nothing. Ilse finished the closure. The line was perfect, neat as embroidery. Bradford nodded approval. In another life you'd have been senior registrar somewhere. Perhaps you still will be. The words broke something in Ilse that had been held tight since capture. She excused herself to the scrub room and cried for 10 minutes, the tears washing away months of shame and fear and the terrible knowledge that she'd been serving a cause that wasted human potential in pursuit of ideology. Frida bloomed in the pharmacy. The head pharmacist, Lieutenant Robert Chen, spoke some German from his grandmother. He taught Frida chemistry, pharmacology, the mathematics of dosing and dilution. She learnt to compound medications, to prepare blood for transfusion, to maintain proper storage for temperature-sensitive drugs. You have a gift for precision, Chen told her one afternoon. Have you considered pharmacy as a career? Frida stared at him. I'm a prisoner. You won't be forever. Wars end. Life continues. You're young, bright. You could have a proper career. The idea was so foreign that Frida couldn't process it. In Germany, her future had been predetermined. Marry, bear children, serve the state. Education beyond basic schooling was discouraged for women. Career ambitions were seen as unfeminine, even unpatriotic. Yet here was a British officer suggesting she had potential, that she could build a life beyond what the regime had planned for her. That evening, the 3 nurses sat together in their hut. Outside, snow fell in thick flakes that muffled sound. Dud. I don't know what to think anymore, Frida said quietly. Everything we were taught, everything we believed, it was all lies. Margaret nodded slowly. Not just lies. Cruelty disguised as strength. Destruction disguised as purpose. We thought we were superior, but we were building nothing, just tearing down, while they... She gestured toward the window, toward the camp, toward Britain. They were building this. Medicines, technologies, systems that save lives. What do we do? Ilse asked. When the war ends, how do we go back to Germany and pretend we don't know what we know now? None of them had an answer. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the camp in white, erasing the distinction between guard towers and huts, between prisoners and guards. between nations at war. Just snow and silence. And 3 women sitting in the dark, rebuilding their understanding of the world from the ground up. February 1945. News from the continent arrived in fragments. The Reich collapsing, cities in ruins, the Allied advance unstoppable. In the camp, German prisoners listened to BBC broadcasts with faces like stone. Some wept. Others retreated into silence. A few attempted to maintain party loyalty, but their voices grew fainter each week. Then the photographs began appearing in newspapers, places the British soldiers called camps, but not POW camps, the other kind. Places where persecution had become systematic extermination, places that made Camp 18's hospital look like paradise by comparison. Fletcher found Margaret in the pharmacy, organising supplies with mechanical precision. "We need to talk," the Major said quietly. They sat in the empty surgical theatre. Fletcher spread newspapers across the table. Images Margaret could barely comprehend. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors reduced to skeletons. Facilities designed not for healing, but for death on an industrial scale. "Did you know?" Fletcher asked. Her voice was careful, controlled. "No." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "We heard rumours, stories, but the party said they were Allied propaganda, lies to justify the war. We were told our leadership was building a better future. We believed." Her voice broke. "We believed we were the civilized ones." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words were measured. "I need to know if I can trust you. All 3 of you. Because this changes everything. I don't understand. The war is ending. Germany is losing. Soon these camps will be liberated and the world will know what happened. When that knowledge becomes public, how people treated German nationals will matter. I've argued that you 3 should stay here, continue working, but I need to know you understand what you were part of, what that regime did." Margaret looked at the photographs until she couldn't anymore. "We didn't know, but we should have. The signs were there, the propaganda about racial purity, the way certain people disappeared. The camps we knew about, the ones we were told were just labour facilities. We should have asked more questions, we should have looked harder. We chose not to see." She met Fletcher's eyes. "And now I see. Everything you've shown us here, the medicine, the technology, the way you treat even your enemies with dignity. It's not just superior equipment. It's a superior philosophy. You believe human life has inherent value. We were taught some lives matter more than others. That's the root of everything. That's why you build hospitals and we built—" She gestured at the newspapers, unable to speak the words. Fletcher gathered the papers slowly. "You'll keep working here. The 3 of you. Not because I've forgiven your country for what it did, but because you're good nurses, and these men need care. Can you live with that? Knowing what your regime did, but still treating the soldiers who served it?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Because they're not the regime. They're boys who were conscripted, indoctrinated, sent to die. They're victims too, in their way. And they deserve to live through this war, and maybe somehow help build something better when it ends." That evening, Margaret gathered Ilse and Frida. They sat in the hospital after hours, the room dark except for one lamp. She showed them the photographs. Ilse covered her mouth with both hands. Frida turned away and vomited into a basin. For hours they sat in silence, processing horror, dismantling the last fragments of belief in the cause they'd served, understanding fully what they'd been part of, even in ignorance. Finally, Ilse spoke. "We can't undo it, what was done, but we can refuse to carry it forward. We can learn from this place, these people. We can choose differently." "How do we live with it?" Frida whispered. "Knowing we were part of that." Margaret had no answer, only the beginning of one. "We become the best nurses we can be. We save every life we can. We remember what we saw here, that medicine exists to heal, not to serve ideology. And when we go home, if we go home, we never forget what happens when doctors start deciding which lives matter. Because that's where it begins. In the small choices. In the moments when we decide someone is less deserving of care. Outside, spring rain began falling. The snow melted, revealing ground beneath. Slowly, inevitably, the earth prepared to bloom again. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended. In Camp 18's recreation hall, prisoners and guards gathered around a wireless. The announcement came in English, then German. Unconditional surrender. The Reich defeated. The war over. No one cheered. The German prisoners sat motionless, processing the end of their world. The British guards stood quietly, respectful, aware they were witnessing something profound. History turning. In the hospital, Margaret made her rounds as always. The routines of medicine didn't stop for victory. Patients needed care, wounds needed dressing, medications needed administering. But everything felt different now. These men weren't enemy combatants anymore. They were just displaced persons, waiting to go home to a country that no longer existed. A young prisoner named Ernst, recovering from pneumonia, caught her sleeve. "What happens to us now?" "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "But you'll be well. That's what matters right now. You'll survive this war, and you'll have a chance to build something new." Fletcher found Margaret in the pharmacy that evening. "I've received orders," she said. "The camp will transition to repatriation processing. In 4 months, most prisoners will return to Germany." "Including you three?" Margaret nodded slowly. She'd known this was coming. "What will we find there?" "Nothing good. Destroyed cities, chaos, starvation, years of rebuilding." Fletcher paused. "But also opportunity. Germany will need doctors and nurses desperately. People who understand modern medicine. People who've seen systems that work. You could help build something better than what existed before." "They'll hate us," Ilse said from the doorway. She'd been listening. "The Germans who suffered through the war. They'll see us as collaborators, traitors. We worked for the British. We learned from them. We abandoned the cause." "Perhaps," Fletcher said. "Or perhaps they'll be grateful for people who learned how to heal properly. How to run hospitals that save lives instead of serving ideology. You can't control how others perceive you. Only what you do with what you've learned." The summer of 1945 passed in a strange limbo. The camp emptied slowly. Prisoners processed and shipped home in groups. The hospital grew quieter each week. But the 3 German nurses continued working, teaching British nurses German medical terminology, learning English phrases, documenting procedures they wanted to remember. In July, Lieutenant Chen pulled Frida aside. "I've written you a letter of recommendation," he said, handing her an envelope. "For pharmacy training, in Germany, Switzerland, wherever you end up. You have talent, don't waste it." Frida held the envelope like it might vanish. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate. Seeing you thrive is thanks enough. Medicine needs people like you, people who care more about helping than about politics." Dr. Bradford did the same for Ilse. "You're one of the finest surgical nurses I've worked with," he told her. "When you get home, find a hospital. Work your way up. Germany will need skilled theatre nurses. Maybe you can train others." For Margaret, Fletcher wrote a detailed reference letter describing her work ethic, her skill, her growth as a medical professional. "You came here expecting brutality," Fletcher said, handing over the letter. "You found something else. Take that with you. Remember that medicine transcends nationality. When you're treating patients, remember they're human beings first. Everything else is secondary." September 15th, 1945. The repatriation convoy was scheduled. The night before departure, they walked through the hospital one final time. The X-ray apparatus hummed softly. Electric lights buzzed. Cabinets full of M&B 693 and morphine stood ready, everything clean, organised, purposeful. "I'll never forget this," Frida whispered. "What medicine could be, should be." "We'll build it," Ilse said with quiet certainty. "Back home. Whatever Germany becomes, we'll build hospitals like this. We'll teach others. We'll refuse to let medicine serve anything but healing. Margaret touched the wall one last time, cool and solid beneath her palm. They didn't have to teach us, didn't have to show us. They could have kept us in ignorance and sent us home, but they chose to share knowledge with their enemies. That's the lesson. That's what we carry back. Not just the techniques, but the philosophy. That wisdom shared multiplies, that teaching heals as surely as medicine does. Morning came cold and clear. The lorry that would take them to the train station waited outside the administrative building. German prisoners heading home crowded aboard, faces a mixture of relief and dread. Margaret, Ilse, and Frieda climbed up last. As the lorry pulled away, Margaret looked back. Major Fletcher stood at the hospital entrance, hand raised in farewell. Behind her, the building's windows caught the rising sun, blazing with reflected light. A beacon. A reminder. A promise. The lorry turned onto the road. Camp 18 disappeared behind them. But its lessons would travel home in the hearts of 3 nurses who'd learned that healing knows no nationality. That technology serves humanity only when guided by compassion, and that the highest purpose of medicine is to preserve life, every life, without exception. They were going home to ruins, but they carried blueprints for rebuilding, not just hospitals but hope, not just knowledge but the wisdom of why that knowledge matters. They had seen the future of medicine, and they would spend the rest of their lives making it real in the broken world they were returning to. Behind them, Britain stretched grey and green. Ahead, Germany waited in darkness. Between the two, 3 women held the light, carrying it carefully, determined it would not go out.